Alright, it's something I'm sure all of you thought you'd never encounter on this channel or any other channel dedicated to Warhammer lore, but it has happened. The dreaded lore of Age of Sigmar. And this might get me drawn and quartered, but I have started to warm up to the growing narrative of the Age of Sigmar universe. AOS 2.0 is a much better and more coherent monster than 1.0 was, and it's starting to come through in the lore in a big way. I'd be remiss if I didn't at least clue you guys in on some of the goings-on in that universe. And this might be a one-off video or the beginning of more AOS on the channel. We'll see how this video goes. But with the announcement of the pointy elves, I think it's only fitting that we discuss the Idoneth Deepkin, mainly because this is the only AOS lore that I actually know, and it's about elves, so, you can see how that's important to me. But there are a lot of very grueling and gnarly aspects of the Idoneth Deepkin that merges a lot of the grimdark that we get from 40k with a lot of the typical fantasy tropes that we get from the world that was, or Warhammer Fantasy as it were. So, in an exciting little adventure, let's dive in, pun intended this time, on the Idoneth Deepkin and the lore of the Children of Mothlon. Before we even really get started, if you want to know all the lore of the Idoneth Deepkin and don't feel like watching this video, just boot up the movie Aquaman. It's like the same damn thing, but okay, bad joke aside, let's jump on in. So after the end times, and before the advent of the AOS lore as we know it, there is a bit of a time of turmoil. This is where the soupy stuff that is the many realms becomes pretty turbulent with all sorts of goings-on and shenanigans. But to spare a lot of murky details on that subject, I'll focus on the important portion of this story. Mothlon, the old elven god of the sea, attempted to hide the remaining elves from the ever-thirsting Slaanesh. Part of the goal of the old elven pantheon was directly fighting Slaanesh and shielding their souls from the hungering Prince of Pleasure. Mothlon tucked those that worshipped him down into the deep underworlds below the tides, hoping to keep them hidden from Slaanesh's sight. But in the end, Slaanesh discovered this final holdfast of elves and devoured them nonetheless, destroying Mothlon in the process. As the mortal realms were created and the surviving deities from the world that was awoke, the newly reborn elf, or I guess I should say Aelf, A-E-L-F. I'm just going to call it elf, guys. Elf sounds weird. So the newly reborn elf gods searched for the remainder of their kin. Those three gods were Tyrion, Teclis, and Malarian. Malarian is basically a combination of Malekith and his dragon Seraphon. Like, the names themselves are even a combination. It's weird. It's a weird synthesis, I'm sure, but that's a story for another time, and one I would have to research and discover and learn. But the three searched the realms for their kin, eventually joining Sigmar's pantheon and helping to civilize the many realms. The only trace of the elves that could be found was but a small faction hidden away in Azerheim, the capital of the Realm of Heavens. The more the gods searched, the more sinister the story became, as they discovered that the souls of their entire race had been devoured by Slaanesh, who had been hiding to essentially sleep off his elven soul food coma, like some fat kid at an all-you-can-eat chocolate cake buffet. The three devised a plot to trap and extract the souls of their kin from the Chaos God. Luring him to the Hidden Gloaming, a realm kind of between Haish and Ulgu, they bound and restrained the Dark Prince. Tyrion, Teclis, and Malarian took turns waterboarding and torturing Slaanesh, before eventually removing all of the devoured souls from the Prince of Pleasure one at a time. The first to be removed were the last to be devoured, the souls that had been secluded deep within the watery realms of Mothlon. These were thusly given to Teclis to reshape in the image of the High Elves of old, instilling this race, what would become called the Sethai, the Awakened, with the regal nobility of the Sons of Ulthuan. Tyrion would be granted a portion that would make their home in Liru, the Bright Haven in the realm of Shaiish. And Malarian would take his share of souls and retreat to Ulgu, the realm of shadows. All of this takes place during the timeline of the Age of Myth, essentially the beginning of everything as the mortal realms take shape. Teclis sought to revive the old gods of the Elven Pantheon with new and invigorated worshippers in the Sethai. Teaching them the ways of the High Elves, his newly wrought race was, at first, very eager to learn. But as time went on, the Sithai became withdrawn and resentful of the light of truth that Teclis represented. Whether this is because of the dark nature of their souls during the trauma they received at the hands of Slaanesh, it's hard to say. It's kind of mentioned in the books that because these souls were so recently devoured, they still retained some of what is essentially Warhammer PTSD from being eaten by a horned god with 18 tits. Teclis tried to purify the darkness that was spreading through the Sithai, but they only rebelled more against the light and sought refuge in the deep, cavernous waterways of Hyeish, plummeting to the darkest depths. Using the magic that Teclis had taught them, the Sithai carved out a civilization at the bottom of the oceans of the Realm of Light, creating multiple enclaves throughout the realm. Teclis reacted by preparing to wipe out the Sithai and start over, but Tyrion, the blind brother god to Teclis, convinced him to show mercy for what is arguably the first elves of the Age of Sigmar universe. So the Sithai were free to govern and rule themselves as they saw fit. Like all elves, the Sithai were children of curiosity and went about the process of determining what exactly was going on with them, why they abhorred the light and tried to hide away from it. In time, portions of the Sithai that could actually sense the stuff that souls are made of discovered that their time within Slaanesh had somehow corrupted them. It was dubbed Malachi, and it would lead to an overwhelming rage that would overtake the elf in question, resulting in savage debauchery where the elf was completely lost. So basically a Slaaneshi version of the Death Company in Warhammer 40,000, more or less, at least kind of how I translated it in my brain. There was another curse that the Sithai discovered as well. With the generations moving on after their flight from Teclis, they discovered that their babies would die before or around the stage of infancy, not living long at all. It was discovered that their souls were withering and dying out far faster than they should. It was estimated that around 1% of babies would actually make it beyond the stage of infancy, and even then, their souls were significantly less bright, quote-unquote, than the original Sithai. The elves took to the surface, looking for any means of recovering or prolonging the dwindling souls of their future generations. The first attempts to bind animal souls to the elves did not work, but on the other hand, other sentient races would essentially empower an elven soul so that it could at least live a third of a normal elf lifespan. It would take something like 6 or so souls to get to this point, and the Sithai took to raiding the coastline of the surface worlds in droves. With the discovery of the worldways deep in the realm of Hyeish, the Sithai's many enclaves splintered and spread out throughout the mortal realms, to all the many facets, Shyish, Akshi, so on and so forth, except for Azure, of course, or Azir. The worldways are essentially these deep sea realm gates that connect to all the mortal realms. I guess you can kind of compare it to Magic the Gathering and how they have realm gates and how those gates kind of traverse to all the different realms of Magic the Gathering. It's very similar to that with the worldways and with all of Age of Sigmar. They can traverse to the different mortal realms through realm gates. The Sithai's need for surface-dwelling races' souls began to shape the very society that they had created. No longer do they refer to themselves as the Sithai, as that exclusively pertains to the first elves freed from Slaanesh, but they now took on a new name, the Idoneth. In the tongue of the elves, this meant extreme seclusion, or depending on the vocal inflection, desperate measures. Both phrases describe the culture very well. Secluded from the outside world, shunned by their creator, and feared by the other races, the Idoneth desperately raid the oceans and coastlines for souls. Throughout the many mortal realms, the sea became a foreboding place, filled with many terrors and fears. Most, if not all, other races directly avoided the open ocean unless absolutely necessary as a means of trade or open war. But how could a race just show up, raid a village, and not expect some sort of counterattack? Well, the Idoneth had known that their survival and their secrecy were linked, so they wove deep and elaborate magic. Every time they appeared on a coastline or raided a shipping vessel, the magic would essentially leave no witnesses behind. Anyone that did survive an Idoneth Deepkin attack, which were very few, would have trouble recounting exactly what they saw, their minds seeming blank or with foggy descriptions of nothing in particular. like waking up the day after day drinking, going to a party, and blacking out next to a box of Totino's pizza rolls. But even the victims of the soul reaving of the Idoneth were locked within a deep coma, one that they would never be roused from, as their soul was no longer in their body. These techniques enabled the Deepkin to raid throughout the Age of Myth, showing fear of the ocean in the other races. The only race to both encounter and recall the attack were the Sylvaneth, aided by their goddess Alarielle, who was immune to the memory-repressing magic of the Idoneth. Destroying a prominent queen of the Domhain enclave of Idoneth Deepkin, Alarielle did not press an attack on the elves, but was now wary of them, and so ended the attacks on the Sylvaneth. It's kind of talked about in the book how, because they're kind of aware of them, the Idoneth Deepkin don't really touch or bother the Sylvaneth, except for little raids here and there. But as the Age of Myth drew to a close and the Age of Chaos began, the Idoneth Deepkin's secrecy started to play on the curiosities of other races in the many realms. As the Idoneth of the Realm of Shadow, the Enclave Igmar, raided the Elves of Ulgu, they began to draw the attention of a Keeper of Secrets, the Greater Demons of Slaanesh. Slish discovered a raiding party from Igmar and follows it back to their colony, attacking it with the might of his demon army. The army is then quickly vanquished by the roused might of the Idoneth Deepkin, but this would mark the first outright aggression against their colonies from a source other than another Idoneth enclave. And as the Age of Chaos grinds on, all of the surface world is besieged by the rampaging might of the forces of chaos, Archaon the Everchosen leading them through each campaign of the mortal realms. Conversely, the Idoneth remain hidden in their kingdoms beneath the tides. That is, until a clan of Skaven finds itself following a seam of Realmstone, it's kind of like Warpstone in Age of Sigmar, and burrows underneath the protective spells of an Idoneth enclave, and bursts through the ocean floor into the colony of the Morfan in the realm of Shyish. This results in a quick battle between the two forces, the Skaven being handedly beaten by the Elves, but again, proves to be another bad sign for the times to come for the Idoneth Deepkin. And with the Age of Chaos coming to an end and the reopening of Azure starting the Age of Sigmar, we have the current timeline that the narrative of the game takes place in, and it is a very hectic time for the Idoneth Deepkin. Archaon the Everchosen begins to suspect that there is more to the oceans than meets the eye. He also questions the severe lack of elves he has encountered on his crusades throughout the mortal realms. He eventually seeks out and tortures the truth from Slish, the depraved greater demon of Slaanesh we talked about earlier, that had discovered the colony of Angmar. From there, he charges the Vermin Lords to seek out this colony and destroy it. Over the next 10 years, multiple Skaven attacks from 3 tunnel networks burrow their way through the floor of Angmar's colony. At the Siege of Blackfire, the Enclave is destroyed, and all of its soul repositories, known as Coryllium, or Chorrilium, are damaged beyond repair. This destruction of an enclave begins a talk amongst the other kings of the Idoneth to possibly have a united front against their new enemies. These talks are led by Volturnos, the High King of the Deep and Lord of the Ion Rack Enclave, the largest and arguably most powerful Idoneth Deepkin enclave. These eventually devolve and nearly result in a civil war that is instead settled via honor duels. The Age of Sigmar moves back and forth between the dealings of Idoneth Deepkin and the Surface Dwellers, making alliances with the Stormcasts and attempting to repair the damage done to relations with the Sylvaneth, as well as continuing to attempt a united front against Chaos. It's kind of how the timeline kind of weaves in between all of these events that's kind of occurred so far. But one last important event I want to talk about is another Skaven fuck-up. Skaven, led by Thanquol, create a gnaw hole in the Kapar Sea in Shyish, draining the entire ocean and revealing the Idoneth Deepkin hidden at the bottom. Secretly hiding away before being fully discovered, the presence of the Deepkin is now known to another terrifying aspect of the Age of Sigmar world. Nagash, the master and god of the realm of the dead, is pretty pissed off that there's a race of creatures whose purpose is centered around stealing souls that he believes rightfully belong to him. Nagash then focuses his sights on destroying all of the Idoneth Deepkin, or at the very least eradicating them from the realm of Shyish. This leads to the great Necroquake that sends the dark necromantic powers of the realm of Shyish throughout the other realms. Armies of the undead sprout up from the ground inside of the defensive quote-unquote bubbles of the enclaves as all walks of life, both above ground and below water, are assailed by the might of Nagash. That brings our sort of, I guess, current events of the Idoneth to a close, and helps you guys understand where they are in the grand scheme of the lore of the era and of Age of Sigmar as a whole. And I'd like to switch gears here before closing this video out and talking about the society of the Idoneth Deepkin, because it's actually very important to not just the army composition, but how the Idoneth are ruled and governed. Essentially, the race is broken into three, I guess 4 different sects. The fourth one would be the Sethai, the original elves from the world that was, whose offspring become the Idoneth. Unfortunately, throughout time and the many battles of the ages, all of the Sethai are dead, and only one remains. High King Volturnos is both the very first and last living of the Sethai, with an age spanning multiple millennia. He's actually a really awesome character in the lore, especially for a character whose origin is solely in Age of Sigmar and not from the previous world, making him a very strong character for the emerging AOS timeline. When we take a look at characters in AOS, we typically look at these characters that have bled over from the world that was: Nagash, Tyrion, Teclis, Morlian, Alariel, Sigmar himself, but Volturnos is a character solely of Age of Sigmar, and that's why I think he's so strong, is because he's a good character. He's not just a shitty character thrown into a bad universe. He's actually pretty solid, so take that for what you will. But the other portions of the society is where the real fun begins. The vast majority of the Idoneth Deepkin are made up of the Namarti. These are the elves that were born with incomplete souls, and make up both the working caste and the foot soldiers of the Idoneth Deepkin. With a short lifespan, for an elf at least, these sightless servants are the thralls and archers of the army, attacking as the main bulk of the raiding forces that reave the coastlines. The Namarti are then ruled over by the Aghelians. This is the primary warrior caste of the Idoneth, making up the elite nobility that were all born with souls, like fully intact. These are the elves that most closely resemble the elves from the world that was. Fair skin, deep black eyes, and pointed ears. They take to war on the backs of eels, gigantic war turtles known as leviathans, or roided out sharks with harpoon launchers on their head called alopex. You know, just the normal seafaring creatures you'd expect. The leader of the Aghelians is an Aghelian king, who in turn is in charge of an enclave. On the same tier as the Aghelians, but acting as a kind of a different purpose in the society, are the Isharan. These are the magic and priest caste of the society, in charge of tending to the well-being of the souls that are taken during the raiding parties and maintaining the Corylliums. To help, I guess, sort of envision what a Coryllium is, it's a living coral reef that stores the souls. So think of it almost like Wraithbone for the Eldar in Warhammer 40,000. That's, of course, a very simplified explanation, but it helps to get your mind aligned, at least, to what I'm talking about. The Isharan have 2 other very important tasks. They weave the mind-altering magic that allows the Idoneth Deepkin to remain hidden during their many raids. But they're also responsible for creating the Ether Sea during these raiding parties. The Ether Sea is essentially this magical wind that surrounds each and every one of the Deepkin, making it appear as if they're underwater still. You know, their hair kind of moving in these ragged, wispy movements, and their movements themselves sharp and clear, much like you would see underwater. It also causes the spontaneous creation of things like shoals, reefs, and other deep-sea characteristics on the shore that the Idoneth are attacking. It's actually pretty crazy. All these facets of society moving in conjunction create the might of the Idoneth Deepkin. But that sums up roughly the lore of the Idoneth Deepkin. I mean, hopefully this video really piqued your interest on the sea elves of Age of Sigmar. And you guys know me and my love for pointy ears, so it really seemed like the most natural starting point for me to get into the lore. And honestly, I can't say that I was disappointed. I think that the elves, while of course borrowing from 40k and fantasy, are an otherwise very original concept for a race of elves. edgy as always, but at least the edge comes with a means of survival, right? They have to get these souls or they will die. It's not just like, oh, we want to raid and tweak our nipples while doing it, or oh, we're Ponzi high elves. It's got a little bit more of an urgency to it. There is a bit more desperation. That's what I was saying. You get a little bit more of this, I guess, the grim, dark feel of this. I mean, you kind of have something almost Cthulhu-esque when you've got these creatures that come from the mist, from the deep ocean, and they put everyone that they attack into deep comas that they can never recover from, and everyone that witnesses them doesn't really ever witness them. It's kind of spooky and it's scary, and I really enjoy it. And I think maybe it was colored by the fact that I was reading the Idoneth Deepkin lore in October, so maybe that kind of colored it all for me, but I like the many facets of the Idoneth themselves. You get the regality and the snobbishness of the High Elves and the Achelians, but the ruthless, mindless raiding of the Dark Elves and the Namarti, with the kind of the wispy crypticness of the Lore Masters and the Isharan. I really kind of like how they've disseminated all this. I also kind of like the names of the Achelians. I think it's just kind of like overly Grecian and sounds pretty cool. But I'm very excited to see what Tyrion's Sun Elves is going to bring us this year as we get closer to that launch. But again, hopefully this makes you want to dive in a bit more on the Age of Sigmar lore. God damn it, I didn't mean to make that pun again. But I was pretty surprised at how easily approachable this lore was, knowing how much of a shit show it was during its first advent. I haven't really gotten into the big mess of the creation of the realms, but I have a great idea of what's going on in the world from just this one book, so I'm pretty happy about that. If you guys would like to hear more about the Idoneth Deepkin, let me know in the comment section below. I'd love to do a video on all of the many enclaves, covering their many different traits, as well as fleshing out High King Volturnos a bit more in that video as well, because, I mean, like I said earlier, he's a pretty badass character. But as always, guys, thank you so much for watching here today. Have a good one, and take care.